Something isn't right in the Biden administration. It looks like perhaps bad feelings between Benjamin Netanyahu and Joe Biden are getting in the way of doing what's right for our allies. Also, anti Semitism is exploding around the country. Donald Trump has 100,000 people show up to a rally in New Jersey. What is going on? To help me understand everything, I have radio host Jason Rance with me. Jason, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back.
So, the United States said that if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel will cancel their invasion of Rafah, U.S. intelligence would give up names and locations of Hamas leaders so that they could be taken out. First, why would the United States be holding back this information from an ally in the first place? Taking out Hamas leaders means not taking out innocent Palestinians. Second, why is the United States not using this information to get American hostages? Like, there's still Americans that were literally kidnapped and stolen by Hamas. What is going on? What is your take on this situation?
So it's a mixture of two different things. On the one hand, you've got members of this administration that are clearly on the radical left. These are folks who believe in the anti-Semitic drivel that we're seeing on college campuses around the country. Then on the other hand, you've got Joe Biden, who is acting here politically. He is terrified of losing this reelection on this particular issue, particularly amongst the very same people who are showing up to college campuses. Now, he's looking specifically at Michigan. He's looking at those close states where, losing 1% of a vote that generally goes your way is going to be the difference between winning a state and losing a state. And I think what he believes he's doing here is keeping Israel from going into Rafah, which I think he believes will be the case even if they were able to get every single Hamas terrorist. My assumption is that we don't have all the intel of every single Hamas terrorist that Israel needs to take out. But to your point, I think it's right. I mean, this is an administration in Israel that goes out of its way to ensure that they don't actually hit civilians. They are hyper targeting Hamas terrorists. Even the story last week that indicated we were withholding certain bombs from or ammunition going to Israel because of the war, like the specific weaponry that they were talking about were ones that would be able to specifically target individuals the way that you would want them to be targeted, rather than just go wholesale in and just drop a bunch of bombs. It's almost like they're putting Israel in an impossible place right now, almost again to their political benefit.
Yeah, the thing that's a little bit confusing is Biden has received more money from the Jewish community than almost any other senator in history. At the same time, it's almost like he like you say, especially with like Michigan, he's trying to play this, well, there's a lot of Muslims that I need votes from, but there's a lot of Jews that I need money from. Maybe I can just make Netanyahu the bad guy. I don't know. There seems like there's brinksmanship and games being played in Washington, D.C.
Well, the political calculus from his perspective is, let's say he alienates a bunch of Jewish voters, which I think is very clearly the case. Well, where are they coming from? For the most part, we're talking about New York, California, and Florida. So those are states that are not up in the air. He's going to win New York. He's going to win California, even if every single Jewish voter said, I'm not going to vote for Biden. And he's going to lose in Florida because they're already going on Team Trump. So from his perspective, it's about Michigan. And when you look at the number of Jewish voters versus Muslim voters in the state of Michigan and in some other states, I think he's obviously looking at others as well, as far as just younger voters, regardless of their religious affiliation. And he's just making a political calculation that right now he stays in power if he hurts Jewish voters. He doesn't stay in power if he hurts Muslim voters or younger demographics of voters that are upset with this particular war based out of, frankly, their just abject ignorance on what's going on and what has gone on.
So over the weekend, I believe there was a big rally in Seattle, and you were there covering it. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it was at the University of Washington. It was put on actually by a non-denominational church that is very, very, very pro-Israel. And they decided to step up, and they have the Pursuit Northwest, they're called. They've stepped up in a pretty significant way since October 7th, saying that they stand with Israel. So they started a rally that was meant to push back against this UW encampment. It's an autonomous encampment, so-called the Liberated Zone, which is another, for those of you who are familiar with my past work, it's Chopper Chad, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, which of course led to dead Black kids, all in the name of Black Lives Matter. And so the University of Washington, unfortunately, has allowed the anti-Semites in this encampment, many of whom are not even students, to completely take over. They've set up their own borders. We were not even allowed to go into the encampment. No Jews are allowed in the encampment, or anyone who's perceived to be a Zionist. And they're just allowed to basically do whatever it is they want. So about 500 or so people showed up on the pro-Israel side. They marched towards the encampment. Again, we're not allowed to go in. And then they took the march back to the church, and they were making sure that people were aware that there are sane people in the city of Seattle. And I was pleasantly surprised by the number of UW students who showed up to support Israel, many of whom were not Jewish. And I really love the idea that, with maybe one exception, every car that was stuck in traffic as a result of the rally, they were honking in favor of the rally. And that's, as a Jew who lives here, that was really great to see.
That is great. What about on the other side, the other coast? President Biden finally gets, or excuse me, President Trump finally gets out of the New York court situation, holds this rally in New Jersey, a predominantly blue state, and ends up having nearly 100,000 people show up. They're chanting USA, USA. It was this incredible, presidential rally. What are your thoughts on that? Is that telling that New Jersey is maybe in play as far as, or is this just people coming out of the woodwork supporting Donald Trump?
So I don't think New Jersey is in play. I think Pennsylvania is very much in play. And that's really who was most likely attracted to this particular event. Obviously, you're going to get people in New Jersey and New York who showed up, but this was really about bringing in Pennsylvania. And it was a great venue for him. Obviously, getting nearly 100,000 people to show up on a weekend to a political rally, that's a pretty huge accomplishment. And you can tell that Team Biden, they were very upset and very worried about this. You had over the weekend a lot of those paid people on X or Twitter going out of their way to say, oh, well, it wasn't actually 100,000 people. Look at how many people were leaving early. No, that's not actually what was happening. Anyone who paid even just a little bit of attention knew that this was a really big event for Donald Trump. And in part, it's because, look, you've kept him from the campaign trail because of the trial in New York. And so there's this even more pent up interest in seeing him speak and hearing what he has to say, not just about the campaign, but in response to world events, what's going on in Israel, what's going on in New York with the phony lawsuit against him, or the court case against him. So I think that's all playing to his favor. And if anyone watched any coverage over the weekend and into Monday from CNN and MSNBC, looking over at some of the more recent polls, they're panicked. And if you're a liberal, you should be panicked right now, because Biden very clearly is not doing very well.
I know. If I was Joe Biden and I went to do a rally and there were more pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine people than my own people, I would be nervous. Yeah. If there's more FJB, MAGA, pro-Donald Trump people than my own people, that would have me very nervous. Then Trump finally gets out of the courtroom, and there's this massive event covered all weekend long, almost 100,000. I would literally be in the White House going, we're going to lose this. We're losing the swing states. The 1% of Muslims in Michigan probably doesn't even matter at this point. What is our next move? I have to imagine they're partly going, okay, how do we pretend like we're going to continue to fight? And also, how do we set up the next Russia collusion hoax so that when Trump's back in office, we can immediately start humiliating him again?
Look, I would say, just politically speaking, he put himself in a really difficult position, Joe Biden. He has repeatedly tried to placate the progressive base while maintaining this tone or maintaining rhetoric that he's a uniter, that he's actually more moderate than people think. And all that's done is annoy all sides of every single issue. When you go out there and you constantly talk about how Bidenomics has improved the economy and inflation is down, when inflation is in fact up, when you tried to take credit for jobs that were quote unquote created when you were the reason why they went away to begin with. People realize that when you tell them that there's nothing going on at the border, when we can quite literally see the videos of what's going on at the border, when you tell us that crime isn't at crisis levels, when people are now more likely than not experiencing a crime personally or knowing someone who experienced a crime, it starts to hurt you. Meanwhile, you've got the progressives who will never truly be happy unless you not only speak like them and think like them, but implement their policies, which this president has been trying to do in certain regards, but obviously has also not been doing. You're just making them even more upset. So he's managed to tick off both sides. Whereas if he were just a reasonable person, if he were more moderate of a Democrat, he would be in the lead right now. I think he could easily beat Donald Trump if he were truly the candidate or the president that he said he would be as a candidate, because there was clearly, particularly amongst independents, who were yearning for that kind of presidency. And he's done quite the opposite of that.
Yeah. You mentioned CNN a couple minutes ago. I read just report after report of people now saying, well, all the polling is going towards Trump. And wait a minute, if Biden's economy is so great, then why do the majority of Americans believe Trump would lead a better economy? Then you have international CNN host Fareed Zakaria. He said, I don't see a scenario in which Joe Biden beats Donald Trump, and his worst political move was having Trump indicted in order to beat Trump. What are your thoughts on his comments?
Yes, in a rare instance, Fareed was 100% correct with that observation. I think most people by now should know that indicting him as many times as they did on just frivolous charges for the most part was a miscalculation. I understand what they were thinking, and had they brought these cases earlier on rather than waiting until the election cycle began, they might have had a different response from the general public. You're always going to get the hardcore Trump supporters who, no matter what, will be on his side. That is the kind of loyalty that few politicians have been able to earn. But you certainly do have a number of people who, look, let's be honest, the polling also suggests that they don't like Donald Trump, nor do they like Joe Biden. They don't want to see a rematch. And these are people who can be convinced to begrudgingly vote for either candidate. But when you start to make it clear that we now live in a country in which we're willing to abuse power in order to go after a candidate you just don't like, I think those independents aren't begrudgingly supporting Trump anymore. I think they lean enthusiastically into his side because they know that it's sending a message that you don't get to pull this kind of stunt or stunts in the United States. Now, I say all of this with a little bit of a caveat. If he's found guilty, even on a frivolous case, that could certainly change things. I mean, people don't necessarily want to be, jubilant over voting for someone who is convicted of a crime, even if you believe that the case itself was frivolous to begin with. I think that that's a little bit of a calculation that, certainly Democrats are still considering, and Biden's people are hoping will come to fruition. But, just watching and listening and reading to the coverage of this New York case, despite what some of the folks over at MSNBC will tell you, and despite what, people are talking about Michael Cohen today, like, there's been a noticeable shift in rhetoric from, oh, this is a slam dunk, he's obviously going to be found guilty, to Democrats saying, I don't think he's going to be found guilty, because they're looking at the case and still wondering, well, what exactly was the crime? You're saying that there was some kind of fraud. We think, kind of, sort of, but we're not sure what it was, because even Alvin Bragg's team isn't really able to explain it clearly to the American people. And you're weeks into a trial that seemed to be pretty simple based upon how they were talking about how much of a home run they had with all of the not just the witness testimony, but all the evidence that was piling up against the president. Yeah, but they haven't been able to provide it. And I think most people now at this point realize this is just a ploy to keep him off of the campaign trail. You're a New York jury. It's going to be hard to get him a fair jury. I think people have rightly pointed out you've got two lawyers on the jury who, even if they loathe Donald Trump, you would hope, particularly given their background in the law, they would look at this and say, this is a little bit too dangerous for me to just give into. So we'll obviously see what's going to happen. I wouldn't be surprised either way if we got a guilty or not guilty verdict. And with both of those comes some significant political implications. And I just don't know quite where they're going to head, but I'm certainly bullish on it going in favor of Donald Trump.
Yeah, I know before the trial started, I can't remember his name, but one of the top prosecutors in New York, he actually bowed out of the case and publicly said, there is no crime here, and my conscience won't allow me to even be a part of this. And so he left Alvin Bragg's team. Who do they replace him with? The number 3 guy at the Department of Justice. And so Biden and Merrick Garland insert one of their top people right into this state case. Pretty interesting there. Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of all of the different cases. But as time goes by, the case is looking worse for the prosecutors and better for Trump. For example, the Jack Smith situation. That was the case that I felt was the strongest. Do I think he committed espionage? No. Why is a billionaire going to sell government secrets for a couple $100,000? It just, like, he makes that an interest. It's nothing, right? So, but, you know, they insult him. They say that, you know, he's definitely going down. Then we find out the FBI rigged the photo, that the DOJ, NARA, and the White House colluded to send the evidence to Trump, and then they use that evidence against him. I don't know. This whole thing kind of reminds me of the Adam Schiff strategy, where you talk about the damning evidence, but you never show the evidence. And enough people will get agitated. Oh my gosh, this evidence that they're about to show, like that's almost worse than the evidence. And then they just never show any, right? Like the Russia collusion. I remember Adam Schiff would come out and be like, if you had just heard what I heard about Donald Trump in that room, I wish I could tell you, but it's a national security risk. It was nothing. It was nothing. But just saying that and his position of authority got people to believe, oh my gosh, this guy's in bed with Vladimir Putin and the KGB and the banks in Russia, and the whole thing ended up just completely falling apart. That's what I see happening with this Jack Smith case. That's what I see happening with so many of these other cases against him.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's worth pointing out is that none of these cases outside of the Manhattan trial will actually go to trial before the election, right? So even if that again was just a big miscalculation. Had they brought this earlier, including the Jack Smith case, which I agree with you that if he was going to be found guilty of anything, it would probably be out of this particular case, just given some of the facts. Doesn't mean I think he committed espionage or was intended in doing that, but this one was a little bit more cut and dry, I think, just legally speaking. Had they brought this even months earlier, a year earlier, they probably would have gotten a conviction, and that would have harmed Donald Trump getting the nomination. I do believe that. But they waited. They waited to do it in a coordinated fashion all at the same time. And ironically enough, each and every one of them have had significant controversies. I mean, just look at what's going on in Georgia. That is now being postponed because of the Fani Willis drama. It turns out sleeping with your special prosecutor before he was your special prosecutor, probably not the greatest move to make. And then becoming a recalcitrant feminist and anti-racist in response to all the criticism just doesn't work anymore. And it's obviously not working in Georgia, where just looking at Donald Trump, I didn't think he would be up as many points as he's currently up in Georgia. But that's a testament not just to the memory of voters who remember life under Trump pre-COVID versus life under Biden post-COVID, but also his impact on the Black community in particular. I don't think he's going to win the majority of Black voters, but he's very clearly seen a significant shift, or at least from a voting demographic perspective, a significant shift of Black voters saying, yeah, I kind of like Donald Trump, or I don't like Joe Biden because of what he promised and what he failed to deliver on.
Yeah. I wanted to get your thoughts on this. I really like RFK Jr. I don't plan to vote for him because even though I like him, I believe he would just fill his cabinet with a bunch of, Biden and Obama Democrats, because that's who he hangs out with, right? But he brought up an interesting point. He said that if he were to get in office, he would put all of the government spending on the blockchain. That way you couldn't change anything. It's locked in, and the American public could view it and scrutinize it. I mean, I understand what he's saying, like from a transparency situation. Do you think that would actually curb this voracious appetite to spend like crazy that the federal government has?
No, because you're like one of 17 people who actually understands what it is he's saying. The average person has no idea. You say blockchain, and most of us are like, wait, what? What are we doing here? This idea that transparency around numbers will change anything is just so ludicrous. I used to think that it would change something, but it doesn't, because there's lots of spending that's transparent, certainly on a local or statewide level, that we all have access to. I have access to budgets, for example, and how the money is spent and where it's going, as does everybody else around me. No one goes to it. No one looks at it. You're still relying essentially on the media to uncover and then report on these stories more than just one time. You have to do it a number of times before the average person even hears it for the first time. And that's just not going to happen outside of just major scandals. You certainly have a media that would do that probably if it was a Republican in office. But if you've got a Democrat or an independent who's pretending not to be a Democrat, I mean, RFK Jr. is very clearly a Democrat. I mean, they're just not going to go after those kinds of stories, nor will I think there be an appetite to go after stories like that, because they tend to be very dense. They're not very interesting to the average person. Otherwise, we would get these stories all the time. There's certainly a dozen stories just today alone, I'm sure, if I look just on a local level, that I can turn into actual stories, but people just aren't all that interested. We say we're interested about this because I think it makes us feel like we come off as really smart and engaged people. It's similar in which people say, I hate negative campaigning. No, you don't. You love negative campaigning. You love the drama. We like what it says about ourselves when we denounce negative campaigns because it makes us feel all virtuous. But at the end of the day, we still react to negative campaigns. Generally speaking, that's what ends up happening. So I wish people were like you and actually interested in this stuff. I wish people were as interested in things I'm interested in, just from like a nerdy political perspective, but they're not, unfortunately. And it seems like no matter how hard some of us try to make people interested, they just do not seem to care all that much. And, I understand in a lot of ways why people aren't, because not only is it dense, you all have lives. I don't. This is what I do for a living, right? I'm looking at this stuff all the time. I'm reading it. I'm watching it. I'm listening to it. I'm doing the research because that's my job. But everyone else has their own jobs, and they don't want to have to do a second job or a third job in their off time.
Yeah, I think most people would love for the government to pay the right amount for hammers and airplanes and all of that. But at the end of the day, they're just trying to figure out, how do I put food on the table next week? How do I pay rent? How do I make this higher mortgage payment? How do I buy a new car? Oh my gosh, my car's broken down again. Oh, we got summer vacation. Well, it's going to be a staycation. We're just going to the movies, kids. So yeah, like they're just bogged down with everyday life of trying to exist and persist. But tell me about your book, What's Killing America, and why. What are we going to learn by reading it?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote What's Killing America for actually the reason I just said, that people were not all that interested in a lot of these stories, is I just give you the basics that you need. I take deep dives when necessary, and I connect dots that often are not connected by media outlets. I cover the local space, not just Seattle, but I go all around the country to talk about the policies that have resulted in these hellscapes in which we live. Seattle, LA, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, Atlanta, all of these cities used to be really great. People used to love Austin and talked about Austin, Texas as this up and coming neighborhood that everyone's going to want to live in. It's trendy. And then all of a sudden, homelessness exploded and drug overdoses are out of control. San Francisco used to be a thriving city. New York was that city everyone wanted to move to. And now, quite the opposite. People can't wait to escape, and they are, in fact, escaping. So, from a variety of different topics through that lens of connecting the dots and pointing specifically to policies and to the language that the left uses to try to convince us everything they're doing is virtuous and amazing, I will explain precisely, giving you only what you actually need to know, rather than all this other frivolous garbage that you just don't have time for. So that when you're able to vote, when you're able to make decisions, when you're able to speak out on behalf of something or against something, you're going to be able to make those decisions and make those arguments in a more informed way. So I hope people will check out What's Killing America. It happens to be there's a sale going on right now. It's the lowest price it's ever been over at Amazon as well as Walmart.com.
Okay, cool. I'll put a link down below. If people want to catch your show, where can I point traffic towards?
Yeah, so you can head on over to jasonrance.com. Has all the links. If you're in Western Washington, I'm on 770 KTTH radio, and the show is available via podcast. So wherever it is you get your podcast, just search my name, and then you'll find me.
Okay, great. I will put that down below. Jason, thank you so much for joining me. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. You as well.